and also Leiden University as part of the CILS network. So Anne, Matthijs, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bert.
Yes, I see slides. Does everyone see them? Yeah, hello everyone. We started this project basically around the submission deadline for this conference. And we hoped to use this occasion to show you what we are currently actively working on. It's really still very fresh, and hopefully to get some useful feedback while we're still in a very early stage. The goal of this project, as the title says, is to get an AI or NLP model to predict which sections of the Dutch legislation are potentially problematic. And our current first approach is to see which provisions in Dutch law have been problematic in the past, and then try to get a model to extrapolate this to the future somehow. Before giving a bit more detail and some very preliminary results, Anne will first give some general background.
Thank you, Matthijs. The study of legislation, sometimes called legisprudence, is a relatively small field, which tends to rely heavily on interpretive methods. That is to say, you need to be a trained lawyer with in-depth knowledge of a particular area of law to understand provisions in a certain law. Take, for instance, the childcare benefit scandal, which I think is now infamous beyond the Dutch borders. At the root of that scandal was a law which unusually did not leave any room for making exceptions. In a previous research project with Johan Boswinkel and Niels Boomstra, we took some first steps towards automatic detection of sections of Dutch legislation that stand out for leaving room for making exceptions and those that do not. However, this was not machine learning, but a rule-based system, which meant that we found provisions that a lawyer would have also detected by reading the text, just a greater amount. The aim of our current ongoing work is to move beyond this rule-based system and build an AI that can detect an unconstrained range of problem types, beyond those reflecting a failure to make room for exceptions. We do not expect such an AI to replace trained lawyers anytime soon, but our hope is that it could be a helpful aid with complementary strengths and weaknesses.
I myself have never worked on law, but only on ordinary non-legal natural language, and I want to give you a very quick glimpse of that. For instance, I've worked on identifying passages in a text that trigger a question. Here's, for instance, a TED Talk that I've used in my research, like a data set of TED Talks, where the speaker says that disability in our age should not prevent anyone from living meaningful lives. And a human annotator that we employed highlighted the meaningful lives and annotated it with this question. It raised this question for them. How does a better prosthetic give meaning to your life? These types of questions that have been the topic of my own research, they often arise when a passage is unclear or contradictory or incomplete. And combining this with honest interest in identifying unclear, contradictory, and otherwise problematic passages in the law is what naturally led to our current project. So, as I mentioned at the start, our approach is to see which passages in the law have been problematic in the past and to get a model to acquire this knowledge, to see patterns in those and try to extrapolate them to the future. Now, how do we know which passages in the law were problematic in the past? This will likely require expert annotation at some point, but thus far we've explored a simpler, cheaper way that works with already available data. And our approach is to look at the changes that have already been made to the law in recent decades, all of which can already be found in the government's public repository. So this is a free source of data that we can try to exploit. The idea is that if a law had to be changed in the past, then at least in some cases, this must have been because there was a genuine problem with the older version of that law. We can therefore try to use law changes as a proxy for potential problems. That's the idea of our current first attempt. So from all the laws and their change histories over the last couple of decades, we extracted around 20,000 passages, 2/3 of which underwent some kind of change. And there are a lot of parameters here that I'm not not mentioning here, such as the length of the passages that we extract and the number of decades that we consider. But in any case, we extracted passages and then used these to train a Dutch BERT-based classifier. Of course, BERT, who else? Where each passage was constructed as a token labeling task. So we trained BERT on predicting, next slide, please. Yes, on predicting for each token of a certain passage of the law, whether that token would be kept or had to be changed to turn into a new version, or deleted, or whether something had to be inserted after that token. And this allows us to use a standard BERT-based classifier on this sort of task. Applying the classifier after training on this token labeling task to a held out test set revealed arguably no spectacular performance. On predicting the change label, the precision and recall were both around 10%. So that doesn't seem very useful to us. We think that this, of course, it's only our first attempt, and we think it reflects not necessarily a shortcoming of the model or of BERT, but of it reflects the difficulty of the task. In particular, it's a very localized task. Without any context, you have to decide whether a certain passage in the law has to be changed or not. And of course, there's a lot of context that ideally the model should take into account. Nevertheless, in some cases, we find that the model's prediction was spot on. For instance, it has acquired the knowledge that this ministry has changed names, that Landbouw en Innovatie has to be deleted. It has also learned that pruimtabak and snuiftabak are no longer to be categorized together with the non-alcoholic drinks. But of course, these changes do not reflect, arguably, do not reflect some problem with the previous version of the law, but merely reflect the passage of time and the mostly bureaucratic changes that this brings. So these are not the most interesting types of changes. These are not the problems in the law that we are after. So for a more meaningful model evaluation, and probably for better training as well, we might need a way to separate these uninteresting changes from the more interesting ones, the changes that are really due to a problem with the law, and focus on those.
Indeed, that is what we're currently working on. What we've shown you so far is just a first very basic exploration. And here are some of the challenges that we want to conquer in the future. An important shortcoming of the current model is the locality of its training data, enforced by the practical word limit of BERT-based classifiers. An isolated short passage from a certain law with little context, no access to external clauses and definitions to which it refers. Another challenge is the lack of annotated data as to which changes in the law were substantial as opposed to merely bureaucratic. We are exploring ways to extract this information from supporting documents, for instance, the official publications of changes or their commentaries. But it seems likely that expert annotations will be necessary. Through this project, we hope to find out to what extent and in what way NLP analysis of legislative texts can serve as a research aid in legisprudence, possibly with practical applications in lawmaking processes as well. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Anna and Matthijs, for sharing the project and the preliminary results that you have. And well, we look forward, of course, to hearing more about more results in the future when you continue working on this. We do take questions, but like the previous part, we do take questions en bloc, which means that we will do that after the next presentation. So the next speaker I will introduce first, and then after that presentation, we'll do the Q&As. Our next speaker is Peter van der Putten, and he is an assistant professor and creative researcher at the Leiden Institute of Advanced Computer Science, LIAX, at our university here in Leiden. And next to his academic position, he is also the director for AI solutions at Pegasystems. So the floor is yours, Peter.
Thank you. Let me share my screen here real quick. There we go. And you should be seeing my first slide. All right, so I'm going to talk about the topic, Trust Me, I Am an AI. It's a joint work with my former students, Jamil Young, Evelien Mols, Joost Molle, and I'd also like to thank my colleague, Maarten Lamers. So today we've already spoken at length about the EU proposed rules for AI. And it's interesting to see how the term trustworthy AI is, you see that a lot in the communication around these regulations. And this was just a proposal in April, but what Katelijne was also already talking about, the publications that preceded it around the EU ethics principles for trustworthy AI, such as robustness, transparency, fairness, and bias. But again, a lot of focus on the word trustworthiness. And so an important question, of course, is how could we make AI trustworthy? So that could be a combination of policy, but also potentially computer science research. For example, I also work on how can we detect bias in automated decisions. But actually, that's not what I'm going to talk about. What I'm going to talk about more is not the question, how can we make AI more trustworthy, but the complementary question of when do people trust an AI? So how do we relate to it, or even how could we bond to an AI? And so look at the actual human behavior, more or less from like a psychological or even philosophical perspective. And that leads me back to why I am actually fascinated by AI, because it provides a mirror image of ourselves. Sometimes it's an ugly mirror. Katelijne already spoke about the bias that exists in the real world, but it can also be a beautiful mirror. And ultimately, it could give us answers to century-old questions like what is intelligence, where is it coming from, how can we learn, but also other aspects of what makes us human. What is interesting that to study this, how we relate to an AI, how people trust an AI, it's more an outside-in perspective. It's not that important whether there's, quote, some real AI inside. And to illustrate that here, I have a study by psychologists Harder and Simmel, and they showed these little movies to test participants in the 40s, and then they would ask these people, what do you see? Try to describe as factually as possible, what do you see in this movie? And of course, no one was responding like we see two triangles and a circle and a square, moving from the northeast to the northwest corner. Everyone was making up all kinds of stories about a boy and a girl they wanted to play, but the father didn't like it. So when the father came home, he scared away the boy or something like that, right? So, and this shows the power of projection. We have a tendency to project intelligence, but also motivations, desires, etc., on the artificial. And that's not that strange. The American philosopher Daniel Dennett calls that the intentional stance. And when, let's say we meet a certain object and we decide first to treat it as a creature, as a rational agent. So we have some ideas about what the goals are of this particular creature, what beliefs and desires it may have, what goals it might have. And based on that, we can actually decide what it ought to do, and we use that to predict its behavior. So if 30,000 years ago I would encounter a saber-toothed tiger, I would have a look at the tiger and think like, you look hungry, so let me climb in this tree, right? So, and this tendency to project, that's very, very strong in people. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk about 3 experiments that have to do with people, why, when, and how people trust an AI. The first experiment, I'm going to turn it around. I'm going to say, not when can a person trust an AI, but when can an AI trust a person. This is an experiment we did together with Jamal Young, and it was around when are people truthful to an AI. So we were asking questions, and we had 3 different conditions, just textual questions in the top right, a video recording of someone who looked a little bit robotic, asking those same questions, or an avatar on the left. And turned out, maybe statistical significance aside, it turned out that people are most honest when being asked questions in text, and least honest, or at least they gave the most socially desirable answers when interacting with the avatar. And so actually the form function of the AI, in quotes here, actually matters in terms of how we interact with the AI. Second experiment that I'm going to talk about centers more on when do people actually obey an AI, for good or for bad reasons. So regardless of whether the AI is truly helpful or not, what influences whether we would actually obey an AI. And we were inspired by research done in the 50s by Ash around groupthink. Famous experiment. You see here a group of people and they need to answer which of these lines is actually shortest. But how it worked, that the only real test person is the person in the white shirt here. And the other people, they pretend to be test persons, but they're only there to every once in a while all give the wrong answer. So, and Ash was measuring, you know, how often people would actually succumb to groupthink. When it was clear that actually this one was the shortest, but everyone would say, no, it's number 2 here. Do we succumb to groupthink? So my student, Evelien, she had a nice idea. She said, like, let's do the same experiment, but not between people, but between a person and an AI. Yeah, so to what extent is there groupthink with the AI? And she developed a experiment called the dismiss decision, where the task is to fire people. So on purpose, we took a very sensitive decision, and people were taking part in the experiment where they needed to decide who to fire. And they were instructed, you see 5 people, they were instructed to fire those people with the lowest average skill. We particularly asked them not to make any interpretations, but strictly follow the rules of firing the employee with the lowest average skill. So you could see it's very similar to length of lines in Ash. And we made that task increasingly difficult. We put people under time pressure. At first they had 15 seconds, but now we're turning it to 12 seconds. But surprise, surprise, to help you, we introduce an AI. And we introduce you an AI that will help you by giving you the right answers. And of course, again, you know, in what we're doing here in terms of groupthink, we try to measure how often people actually follow the advice of the AI. And we use different ways to frame the AI. You know, it's very accurate. It's been used for a long time. Social proof, a lot of other people have used the AI, or historical usage. And turns out that in around 70% of cases, for most conditions, people are following more or less blindly the advice that the AI is given, especially when they are under this time pressure. You can see there's one exception here, condition number 5. Interestingly enough, when we framed it as a tool that was useful because other people were using it in the experiment, people had less trust in the AI. So people trust the AI a lot, especially under time pressure, only if we say other people are using it. So if we have to rely on the judgment of people, it's actually less accepted. So a bit of a scary result, maybe, this over-reliance on AI. A final example is more around bonding. So when we talk about trust in AI, trust and bonding is actually related. And what we did, well, what Joost actually did, my student here, he created some couch surfing robots. And why did he do that? He said, well, you know, there could be different reasons why people develop trust with a robot. It could be because of its appearance. Maybe it looks like a person or an animal, or maybe it has interesting interactive behavior. But I'm going to create robots that have neither of that. So I want them to be abstract, just a box like you see here. And the only behavior they had is they were awake at night, went awake during the day, went at sleep at night. Yeah, so that was it. And we wanted to look to what extent common locus actually was a factor. The mere fact that we're spending time in with the actual robot and have these shared experiences. So he gave these robots to people. It said like, hey, I want to stay with you, spend some time with you. If you're fed up with me, just hand me to the next family, and here's a phone number, and let us know how I'm doing. So we were receiving all these WhatsApp messages, and we could actually analyze what was going on. These couch surfing robots, they're still out there roaming the world, but we get this information returned. So they put a robot in a context with other creatures, either real ones or stuffed ones, as you can see. or people retain the common locus. They take the robot with them outside when they go to a park or when they go to work or something like that. Yeah, so, and what we saw here, that again, very similar to what Dennett actually said, that what most common happens is that we first decide that we want to treat this object as a creature by giving it a gender, by giving it a name. Yeah? And then we start to attribute these beliefs, intentions, desires onto the blockbot, despite that it was not looking like a human or an animal and that it didn't have any interesting behavior. Yeah, so 3 interesting experiments that you see listed here that all provide maybe a somewhat different perspective on the question of when and how do people trust an AI. And that's also relevant for AI in law, because we quite often maybe fall in the trap of assuming that people are acting very rationally. If we AI just make a little bit more transparent or let it explain itself, maybe this is how we can control the use of AI, but it's important to take a step back and really have this human approach to studying why do people bond or how do they interact or relate to an AI, because we sometimes behave not as you would expect, even if you would develop policy for AI, etc. Right, so with that, I am at the end of my presentation. I think it also shows that we shouldn't just study artificial intelligence. Actually, we should study artificial X, artificial anything that makes us human, also artificial emotions, creativity, etc. They are important in this whole debate question of how do we relate to the AI and how do we bond with them. So if you want to know more, just look me up online or hit me up on Twitter, and I'll be more than happy to talk to you.
Thank you. Very interesting experiments and interesting results as well. I'm pretty sure this raises some questions and also the previous presentation. So if you have a question, please raise your virtual hand or put something in the chat box and we can have a discussion. Perhaps I'll kick off with a question that I have myself for Peter relating to his presentation, because the other day I was reading the book, the bestseller book, Everybody Lies. Maybe you're familiar with that one. It's a book which says actually that if you ask questions on Google, it's kind of a truth serum in the sense that everybody wants to know an exact answer to an exact question. They don't lie to Google, but people, when they're on Facebook, they lie because they want to look better, right? So my question relating to the experiment you did, what kind of questions did you ask actually? Because it might depend heavily on which questions you ask, which kind of answers you can expect, and the extent there are lies in this.
Yeah, Bart, that's an excellent question. We used a social desirability scale. Actually, the fun thing about psychologists, they have a scale for everything. It was actually, we used an official scale to, as a proxy for honesty, we took how socially desirable your answers is. So that's not the exact same thing as honesty, but it is a proxy. If people tend to give more, these are a little bit more awkward questions, so it's trying to, it's really designed to make it a little bit hard to be honest in terms of how you're answering those questions. And it's an instrument that has been used more often in this type of honesty research.
I see 2 questions in the chat box, but I'm not sure if I completely understand them. So one question is by Karen, who says, what about the AI black box? So can perhaps Karen elaborate on that, or perhaps any of the presenters has a response to that?
Yeah, I can give it a very quick answer. So because when people talk about transparency and AI as a black box, let's say from a computer science perspective, people talk about, oh, how can we, when an AI gives a decision, we have a right to an explanation. How can we build algorithms that will generate an explanation along with a prediction or decision or something like that? But more along the lines what I just presented is that, actually a different perspective is that, so I think AI should be transparent, just to be clear. But in the behavior of people don't have a lot of issues projecting all kinds of stuff on a teddy bear or a robot or It's almost we need to kind of discourage people to stop projecting all of those things on the AI. So it's very important that we make AI more transparent, and people are working on things to kind of white box AI and the decisions that are being taken. But also I think people are we shouldn't overestimate or rely on the fact that we think that people are in their real behavior that they are asking for these explanations all the time. Actually, it's almost the other way around. There's an over-reliance, so they're quite happy to make all kinds of projections on top of the black box, regardless whether they're correct or not.
Okay, thank you. I see another question by Edward, but maybe you can read your own question, Edward.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Peter, for such an interesting talk. It gives me somehow it leaves me with a mixed feeling into what are the implications that this may have, because then if we do have a tendency into just clicking yes, no, or to what it is presented to us as a sort of true, then it means that the power that the developers and the companies behind them have actually reaches levels that they are beyond our comprehension. No? And my question then to you is that then it seems that then maybe design plays a super crucial role, but also ourselves and how we perceive reality. Should we then be looking at a sort of double strategy in which we alert developers about those consequences?
No, yeah, I think I think you're completely right. So if it made you feel uneasy, that was slightly intentional, right? Because this is research that's a little bit on the boundary, or it's intent to warn people a little bit, and also it's looking at some of the uneasiness around AI. But it is important. I think there's important lessons to be drawn for research or designers of AI or creators of AI. To take that example, when I took Daniel Dennett's intentional stance, first we decide we want to treat you as a creature, so we name you, etc., and then we project all these things on you. So let's say I make a good robot that helps elderly people. Fine, let's say it's all good AI for good. And then of course it's great if we turn it, if we encourage that the robot is going to be named by grandma. On the flip side, let's say we have a bomb squad, a robot that's used in a bomb squad to clear mines. The recommendation could be the other way around. The recommendation could be instruct your military personnel to not name the robot, store it with, dehumanize it, yeah, store it with other equipment like shovels and spades, right? So try to because that anthropomorphication effect is so strong, and then in that instance you want to discourage that people start to anthropomorphize the bomb removal robot, because that would put let's say military at harm for a piece of kit. You know, if there's a dangerous situation and the robot blows up, it's not the end of the world. No one should try and save the robot. Yeah.
Would
so,
then be somehow in line with what we were saying before about this specific sector approach, in which in some occasions then the embodiment of the robot might be encouraged and even seen as good, because for instance in therapeutic purposes it seems that it's very much supports the interaction, and such interaction helps achieve certain goals and so. But then in other contexts, the very same type of interactions may have to be discouraged because of the ulterior adverse effects that this may have for certain parts of the population.
Yeah, I was going to ask one more question to Anne and Matthijs, because they focus more on AI that has not a physical appearance, contrary to the research that Peter is doing. And well, you shared some preliminary results, but I was wondering what are the next steps? So can you briefly elaborate on what the next steps in your project and your research are?
Sure, should I start? So I think basically trying to improve the relevance of the results for the moment, on the one hand, by some limited expert annotation by me as a lawyer, and on the one hand, by trying to find additional data that could enrich our understanding of the legislative textual data themselves. But maybe Matthijs has something to add?
Not really something to add, but maybe to elaborate a little bit. So currently the model takes as input a passage of like 5 sentences from a law, which is very little to be able to understand what it's really about, especially because these paragraphs in the law, they are all cross-referencing each other. So that's one way in which the current approach is too localist. Another way in which it is too localist, so we can't really expect much of the model, is that it only looks at the laws themselves. Whereas to really be able to detect a problem in the law, you would also need to know what's going on in the world. For instance, how is the law being used in court? What kind of decisions are based on that law? That's of course something that Anna knows a lot more about than me.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think both presentations are excellent examples of multidisciplinary research in which we try to combine different disciplines, different perspectives on these developments, and as such, they're highly valuable. I think I'll keep track on all the developments and results that you'll have in the near future. With that, I would like to wrap up the second part. We're up for a very short break, and then we move on to the next part, which is more focused on education of law and AI. That will be starting at 4 o'clock sharp. So I think on my clock, it's about 8 or 9 minutes until then. So we can have a short break and then we can reconvene. So I hope to see you all then.